I was asked to wait a second. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Monday Colloquium. I get the wonderful opportunity to introduce Salome today, who we've had at the Ostrom Workshop several times. And she's now at the University of Michigan, which is, yeah, right. And, you know, good luck all season and all that type of stuff, right? Because we're not a football school, but we still like football. But the cool part about, you know, this opportunity is I have read her work for a considerable period of time. So when this invite goes out, if she doesn't say yes, I'm crushed. I actually asked her last year to be sure she could be on this year's calendar. And so I'm just incredibly fortunate and very glad that you're here. So thank you very much. And we look forward to your topic today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Angie. It's great to be here. It's great to be back with you all. Yeah, so the talk I'm presenting today is based on a paper that is co-authored with a good friend of mine, Amanda Parsons, who is an international tax law scholar at UC Boulder. And we like to joke, this paper is what happens when a tax scholar and a data governance scholar have offices across the hall from each other and just chat way too much. So we were fellows together at Columbia when this piece just kind of emerged out of a lot of conversations we were having and spending too much time chatting and hanging out in each other's offices. So good things come from chatting. So as a way in, this is a nice little statistic that I like to start with. We are generating a lot of data. Since the advent of computers to 2018, the sum total of all the data produced was about 127 trillion gigabytes. Do not ask me how Statista comes up with these numbers, but we will use them as a rough guidepost. And we are expected to produce more than that in just this 1 year, right? 2024, more than that total sum from the advent of computing just to 2018. To put where all this data is coming from in some perspective, connected cars, which is like most contemporary cars now, smart cars like Tesla, but really just any car these days, they generate up to 25 gigabytes of data per hour. So it's just kind of all of the things we're doing is just generating an increasing amount of information. And all of this data makes companies a lot of money. So data intensive businesses are kind of a key strategy for some of the largest and wealthiest companies today. So, you know, you have your standard people up there, your Apples, Microsofts, Amazon, Meta, Tesla. I sometimes say here, you wouldn't think of it, but this group probably would think of it. Visa and United Health are huge data companies. They generate and collect tons of data. And of course, a recent addition to this list, NVIDIA, AI company, AI models, of course, trained on gobs and gobs of data. So as a person who thinks of commercial surveillance in the digital economy, I'm kind of used to thinking about this in terms of the social problems and social disruptions that result from all of this. But in this piece, Amanda and I were really interested in kind of thinking through the political economy of all of this. So, right, like what's happening here, why, and how and why is law, at least the areas of law that we know, which is tax and data governance, so like bad at apprehending their role in kind of structuring and managing and regulating all of this activity. Because we both kind of, in the course of our conversations, really were struck by our persistent sense that law is really poorly equipped to meet and manage what we see as like sort of just a common mode of production in the digital economy, by which we just kind of mean all the strategies, tactics, investment bets, and business plans that companies use to turn data about people into wealth and power. And all of the ways that pursuit of wealth in this way might create distortive economic effects, patterns of excessive concentration of wealth and power, accruals of concerning kinds of power that we think are at least arguably of legal and regulatory relevance, but also have potential, subject to different legal and regulatory structures, to really achieve real social benefits. So this piece is just kind of our attempt to explain or account for why this disjuncture between law and the digital economy exists, which again, we think matters for both its missed opportunities in terms of managing harms, as well as kind of fostering benefits. So to do that, the piece really focuses on a particular source of value, which we call social data, and the novel subspecies of use value that it provides, which we call prediction value, and kind of charts why this novel store and type of value is at odds with legal regimes that are presumably tasked with regulating how the source of value is created, accumulated, and used. So to think about that, we just kind of think through a couple of definitions here. So first, social data. So social data we use to refer jointly to two interrelated categories of information, materialized information as data. So first, data that collects traces of human activity directly, right? So that's just information produced from us interacting with censored, connected, like networked objects that sort of pick up traces of us living our lives and sort of digitally apprehends them. And second, the category of data that is used to apprehend, infer, or predict human activity. So this doesn't necessarily have to stem from humans, right? Like weather patterns are pretty good at predicting traffic, right? So that's not inferred directly from people, but it is used to infer or predict human behavior. And in contrast with the more kind of commonplace legal term personal data, we like the term social data because it also expresses our view that data is useful, socially and economically valuable, not for what it can tell a company about me, right? But about how data about me, when combined with lots of other data from lots of other people and non-human sources, can reveal about groups. Prediction value we use to refer to, again, that specific use value that results from the cultivation and accumulation of social data. So by this, we just kind of mean that social data assets are used by entities to provide insight into human behavior, to guide predictions about that behavior, and to optimize various strategies to kind of intervene in or modify that behavior. So in other words, the value of social data lies in its capacity to apprehend and predict human behavior. And that in turn provides entities the capacity to exert some measure of control over future behavior on the basis of that materialized insight. So again, in the piece, we kind of think that it's useful to think of prediction value as a kind of use value and hold that use value distinct from exchange value, which is just how we normally think of value, right? That's just the price. That's just willingness to pay. And we just want to hold the two concepts apart because, as a lot of the piece kind of details, the transformation of prediction value into exchange value is messy and complicated and time delayed, and a lot of interesting, relevant stuff is happening in that kind of gap, conceptual gap. And part one is really kind of a meditation on value and exhortation to hold the concept apart from just willingness to pay. Okay, so I'm just going to give a quick example. Examples are good, just to sort of concretize this abstract discussion. So we have a data subject here, Anna. Anna is 13 weeks pregnant. And Anna uses Apricot, which is a popular fertility tracking app, social media site, where she can upload information about her ovulation cycle, eating habits, exercise patterns, mood changes, a wide range of physical symptoms. Apricot aggregates and synthesizes all the data that all of the Annas, all of their users are sharing, not to sell that data directly, which they reassure their users they would never do, but to sell insights about their user base to various clients like advertisers, employment consultancies, consumer credit agencies, and others. And that's how Apricot makes money. These clients, in turn, can combine insights from Apricot data with other data, right, on users' TV viewing habits, movement patterns, online purchasing behavior, to sort of develop a rich picture of this population of people who are pregnant or likely to be pregnant. So Becca, who does not use Apricot, fits the behavioral patterns that emerge from the analysis of Apricot users. So like Anna and others, she exhibits the same patterns of changed TV viewing and online purchasing behavior that indicates that she too is or is likely pregnant. So in a basic sense, because of how and why digital companies like Apricot collect and use data about Anna and all the other Annas out there, data about their pregnancy is also data about Becca's pregnancy. So that's what we mean by the idea of social data. And I like using this example because early pregnancy data is like famously very valuable. Having a child is a big event in a consumer's life. It's a time when Anna is about to drastically change her consumptive habits, where she's buying from, what she's buying. So this is a really lucrative time to get to her, right? To nudge her into a desired set of purchasing behaviors, lifestyle behaviors. But it's also kind of just a generally lucrative time to study consumptive habits, to understand how pregnant consumers change and what they change into when undergoing this moment of rupture. So the value of data inferring or predicting pregnancy status is its prediction value. And it's important to note that prediction value isn't just always or automatically or easily converted or transformed into exchange value. Or not only that, right? It confers power over Anna that is in some sense more general than just its price. It can be used to enact social discipline and moral judgment, quite apart from any kind of commodified market value that control confers. So I grew up in Nebraska, I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska. And under current state law, right, if Becca were to miscarry in a suspicious manner next week, and this information was used to pursue enforcement actions against her, then she could face like real legal charges, real like risk of imprisonment, which is like a form of exercising that prediction value, right? It's serving to sort of enforce this social or political position on her in virtue of her being a pregnant person, exposing her to discipline and punishment. And that's like a bad example of exercising prediction value in a non-commodified way, but it's important to note that this has like a hypothetical, like good counterpoint, right? That same prediction value could be used to exercise or enact social services and moral acclaim. So if knowledge of Becca's pregnancy triggers health services to send her prenatal vitamins, to connect her to local prenatal services and community programs, helps hospital services in her area kind of like plan for who's going to have a pregnancy at which time and like allocate resources and services accordingly, then that same prediction value is being sort of exercised in a way that kind of alleviates and socializes the social and material costs of biological reproduction, right? So we're sort of exercising it in a good way. So that's just kind of a further note on prediction value. So in the paper, we're really advancing two claims with respect to the social data value and the use value that it provides. So again, claim one is just that prediction value is a particular form of use value that is kind of a paradigmatic value form of the contemporary informationalized economy. And its transformation into exchange value, value as indexed and priced by markets, it's complicated, it's imperfect, it's not straightforward. And this messy kind of imperfect gap really matters for understanding the digital economy. It has legal and regulatory relevance. The second claim is that social data and prediction values' role in the wealth accumulation strategies of the digital economy really confound traditional ways that law handles or thinks of the regulation of both data about people and the cultivation and accumulation of value. So I'm going to start with claim one. So the article really details how prediction value is cultivated and divides this activity into kind of three, what we call scripts for producing value. Script one is just direct conversion. So this is like companies can collect, the Apricot can collect the data from Anna. They can sell that data directly, right? Data brokers are engaged in a lot of direct buying and selling of data. That's a way of turning prediction value into an exchange value. But they can also sell access to the data's value. And this is actually a much more prevalent business model, right? So think about targeted advertising from Facebook. Facebook doesn't sell data directly. They sit on the data asset's value and they sell the insight or sort of derived value of that asset to their advertisers, similar to Apricot in my example. Script two is indirect conversion. And this is meant to detail how companies use data to develop new products and services more quickly at lower cost. So Square is, of course, the company that you tap your phone on, right? They get into the business of commercial lending. They are in the business of also providing commercial loans. And the way they use like my data about the fact that I bought coffee at Joe Coffee at 116th and Broadway, like every single day, twice a day for 2 years, right? The way they use that data isn't like to target me with ads for Joe Coffee, even though they could, but they leverage their position, their sort of structural market position between buyers and sellers, and their ability to accumulate like really good longitudinal full transaction data to understand the landscape of consumer purchasing in which a business operates, to offer business loans on the basis of a really deep understanding of that business and its customers. So the pitch here is something like Square has a reduced need to like price in risk into their commercial lending, which means that they can offer more attractive, more accurate, more competitive rates for businesses. So that's how they're sort of using prediction value to get into a new business at like a lower risk or with a greater degree of accuracy. Script 2 also is where companies can use social data value to lower cost by squeezing surplus, either from workers or increasing revenue by squeezing surplus from consumers. So on the worker side, you have a lot of work detailing things like algorithmic management of surveilled workers, which is associated with lower wages and increased returns to platforms. So people have really done great work here detailing like Uber and Lyft, sort of knowing that a driver is just about to log off at 5 and then giving them like a little burst just to keep them on a little bit longer, sort of really trying to manage the like surplus extraction from workers. But it's also kind of similarly applied on the consumer side, can be used to engage in something like first-degree price discrimination or something approaching first-degree price discrimination, which is, of course, associated with just capturing a higher surplus from consumers by platforms. And this is something that Joe Stiglitz has done quite a lot of recent writing about. And then there's script 3, which is, I think for me as a data governance scholar, like the part that I'm sort of most familiar with, but for Amanda as a tax scholar, the part that she's like, I don't know what this is. But this is kind of our indefinitely delayed or non-conversion kind of script of value accrual, which is really sort of meant to capture, again, that kind of idea that I had the like, Nebraska teen example for, which is that social data value is not just an accrual of wealth. It's a more general form of value that is also an accrual of power that can be converted into wealth, but doesn't have to be converted into wealth. And it represents, I think, the direction of informational capitalist mode of production that is like the most both troubling and promising. But again, this is getting at that idea I gestured before that prediction value need not be converted into exchange value to be valuable in the social and economic sense. And a kind of like commercial version of this, that's not like, you know, I don't think companies are going to be engaged in like disciplining people for being pregnant necessarily, but you can think of something like Uber's Project Gray Wall, or is it Gray Ball or Gray Wall, where they would like zone around civic centers so that they could illegally operate in markets, know who was likely to be a civil servant that would report them, build up their ridership such that it would then become like politically costly or, you know, impossible for cities to crack down. So they're using prediction value for like political ends, for like political purposes there. And of course, it's in service of a larger business model, but it's not like that was like a money-making scheme for them. That was like a political kind of lobbying scheme for them. And you can sort of see a similar thing with Airbnb facing like local crackdowns in various communities. If they know that they're facing sort of local resistance or likely local resistance, they'll often sort of try to reach out to users that are in that area, hosts in that area, to really sort of encourage them to directly lobby and talk about the harm that regulation would use. So there again, they're sort of converting prediction value into sort of a political goal that's not a clear like wealth accumulation strategy. So the second claim that we sort of work through in the piece is that social data and prediction values role, right, confounds the traditional way that law handles or thinks of regulation of data and just the general cultivation and accumulation of value. And this is sort of where our conversations really started. And we use our own fields to kind of detail the two ways in which this disconnect happens. The first kind of class of problem is that of legal regimes that have historically been tasked and understands themselves to be in the business of governing value creation, like tax, right? Tax is where we do tax and transfer. It's where we redistribute the relative gains of the pie that we've done in the market economy back into kind of relative redistribution. And these kinds of, other areas of law that are in the business of regulating value creation, you can think of antitrust or competition law. They're sort of governing the rules of the game and markets, thinking about on market forms of market concentration that harm consumers, and sort of managing the rules of how companies can go about accruing value, and they manage that. We sort of think these areas of law are struggling to apply those existing regimes to all of this activity of cultivating prediction value. So we obviously focus on international tax, that's Amanda's area, and the struggle of international tax law to grant taxing authority on the wealth of the digital economy. So there have been multiple attempts at the OECD to kind of create a new framework for allocating taxing authority on digital wealth creation. They keep falling apart. And our kind of account of why this is in part because tax just does not have a way of thinking about prediction value absent exchange value. And I am not a tax law scholar, so I punt on all the questions of tax, but my sense from Amanda is that this is kind of a class of a more general problem or like a more general fight in tax, which is a fight between taxing wealth versus taxing income, or like moments when wealth sort of converts and meets the market. And that's a more general fight. It's an ongoing fight. There are pros and cons on both sides. But what I think she would say, channeling her here imperfectly as not a tax scholar, is that whatever your position on that debate was, because so much of how the digital economy is operating and accruing wealth is in this form of prediction value that doesn't immediately or really ever have to convert into exchange value, it sort of should shift the relative merits of those two positions. Because if you're, for example, India, and you have 1 billion WhatsApp users who are cultivating and creating a lot of prediction value for Meta, under kind of like a wealth tax regime, you would get taxing authority over that wealth generation. Under our existing tax regime, which is sort of an income moment, so like the moment it transacts or converts, you do not get taxing authority over the cultivation. And maybe that's fine pre-digital economy, or like the relative merits of the income versus wealth position, you come down on that one side pre-digital economy, but in a digital economy where so much wealth creation of the largest and richest companies in the world is prediction value, maybe you rethink that position. The second problem, which is much more in my wheelhouse as a data governance scholar, is legal regimes that are regulating data production. That's what privacy and data governance is. It's kind of one of the primary legal regimes that governs how this product is produced and managed, but don't really understand themselves to be in the business of value regulation, the way that tax understands itself to be in the business of value regulation. So there's sort of an inadequacy, I think, in the approach of governing massive back-end systemic processes of value creation through something like the assignment of an individual privacy right that's really primarily meant to protect one set of legal interests in social data, like my privacy interest, but that couldn't possibly capture all of the social and political and economic effects of social data production at the scale of the digital economy. That's sort of like thinking we can govern the financialization of mortgages and creation of mortgage-backed securities through like my property right. Wholly inadequate. That's not how we govern mortgage-backed securities. That's not how we ought to govern mortgage-backed securities, but that's kind of the rough analogy if you want to think about it. Or thinking about trespass law is sufficient to govern the financial market for mortgage-backed securities. So just a few closing remarks, since I'm getting between 20 and 25 minutes now, of like what we think this approach gets us, just holding prediction value and exchange value apart a little bit and thinking about their relationship. The first is really conceptual, that turning to these old concepts in classic political economy of use value and exchange value can just be really helpful, right? For getting a handle on disconnects that vex the digital economy. Just again, like lots of things are happening prior to the moment that informationalized inputs meet the market, if they ever do, and a lot of it is significant. The second, again, is just doctrinal, focusing on my area. Taking seriously that challenge of governing prediction value means moving beyond privacy to far more robust institutional forms of data governance. We just don't typically think that my permission to enter my property or not is sufficient to govern systemic effects that can arise from economic activity. So again, that's just kind of a basic point. A potential tax takeaway, again, is sort of boosting all of the arguments for taxing wealth as opposed to taxing like income or moments when wealth converts into an income form. And is also perhaps more ambitiously an argument in favor of at least some areas of pre-distribution, right? So if it turns out that prediction value is something for which it's really hard to do post hoc redistribution, and it kind of throws a spanner in the works of the traditional neoclassical two-step of let market efficiency grow the pie, worry about the redistribution of relative gains on the back end with the tax system, maybe it makes us in some areas more in favor of forms of pre-distribution, because prediction value is really hard to redistribute relative gains from. So, it might target certain areas where we think pre-distribution might be a better fit. And the third is kind of normative, and that's really beyond the scope of this piece, but is really of keen interest for both Amanda and I, and particularly for me in my more normative theoretical work, which is that I think it's really helpful to disambiguate claims of why we think the datafication of social life is bad or wrongful, to kind of hold apart prediction value and exchange value. So do we think that the cultivation of prediction value is itself bad? So that prediction value is being cultivated at all is the problem? Or is it the ways in which the political economy of prediction values cultivation, what kind of prediction value is being produced, by who, for what reasons, how's it being used, is being dictated by the imperfect processes of prediction values transformation into exchange value. And so we can kind of hold apart those two things and say like, okay, at least as an initial descriptive step, I think saying like, getting clear on like, which normative accounts really have a problem with just the prediction value cultivation itself, and which ones really are sort of more concerned with the tying of prediction values cultivation with kind of the imperatives of its messy and imperfect transformation into exchange value. Okay, so I'll stop there and really look forward to talking about this with you all.
Thank you. So I'm keeping an eye on the queue in the Zoom world. I don't have anything right now, so we start with students. Who, Simon?
Yes, very enjoyed your talk, and good to see you again after PLSC.
Yeah.
So two questions. One is actually resonating with what I asked before, which is your categorization about prediction value and exchange value.
Sorry.
Again, so in the early, we have to but in the business, in the area of business analytics, right, there are different ways to characterize data and to make there are predictive business analytics, descriptive, and all of those. So I was wondering, like, maybe how does your kind of characterization resonate with what business analytics, they have a huge discipline of creating different equations on categorizing value, data's value. How does that kind of resonate with that? The second is the choice of the solution. So I completely agree that privacy law, they focus on personal information. They don't think about the aggregated aspect of data. And your solution here is that tax is a way to provide a solution. Is a way to address that. So I was wondering, what about like data trust, or thinking it in the form of property, AI regulation, internet intermediary liability. So all of these can also offer some sort of can also kind of address the issue of social data, and maybe also touch on like the characterization that you've offered in some ways. So I was wondering, like, whether there are any like maybe further justification about why tax is the way to address this issue.
Yeah, great questions. So first I'll caveat that I'm not like deep in the literature of business analytics, so I can't generally speak to that, but I do follow at a glancing level and regularly check in with like information economics of people trying to sort of, or like accounting strategies of trying to sort of account and create like tangible valuations of data. And I think the benefit for us of returning really to this sort of, again, old tradition in economics of holding apart use value from exchange value is that business analytics is in the like, generally, unlike accounting, is in the hard business of trying to assign a dollar value, that's an exchange value, to data. And what an exchange value is either like literally the market price that data fetches when you buy it from a data broker, or of course you are estimating what it would be in like a hypothetical market. Those are both forms of exchange value. That's like what like in contemporary economics, value just is exchange value, right? We've gone through a long process of trying to sort of formally understand the relation. It fails to sort of like systematically convert. So it just, that is exchange value. And I think there's value in that exercise of sort of trying to understand, like, were there to be a market, what is the dollar value we would assign? Because a lot of how the contemporary economy and its regulation functions is by assigning dollar values to things. Like, I'm not against that, like we should do that. But for purposes of our article, it was really helpful to just hold apart, right? Use value is not like the behavioral economic studies that show that people systematically overvalue things that they already own over the exchange. That is like a difference in degree along the same conceptual dimension of exchange value. It's just a different category of value, just a different way of thinking about what value is. The value I get from enjoying my coat and using it and wearing it as a coat is just a different way of valuing my coat than selling it on the secondhand market. And again, we think that's helpful to just hold apart because then we can look at like, okay, well, what are all the ways that use value, what are all the ways that prediction value is used to produce value in companies? And we're not thinking about its imagined dollar sign value, you know, we're just sort of detailing that. So that's how it connects. I'm in favor of more systemized understandings, more systematic attempts to sort of develop accurate exchange value estimates for data and the data markets. But again, I think it's kind of nice to just return to this old tradition of holding the two conceptually apart just for a second to say like, what's going on here? Like, how is this stuff being used? Before immediately thinking like, oh, okay, and like, how are we going to convert that into a price dollar value sign? On the second point, yeah, I want to clarify, like, it's not that we think the tax problem is going to solve the data governance problem. I think we think that a lot of legal regimes need to account for this. So tax needs to change, but data governance needs to change too. Antitrust likely needs to change. We're not talking about antitrust because we're not antitrust scholars. Everyone wants us to talk about antitrust, but we don't want to because we're not antitrust scholars, but we recognize our diagnosis of a lot of the Sturm and Drang that's going on right now in antitrust with respect to the digital economy, we would diagnose as another class of this problem of the messy and imperfect and complicated transformation of prediction value into exchange value. So tax needs to change, privacy needs to change. On the various sort of things that you discussed, you know, I think all of the one kind of way of understanding a lot of these like floated potential solutions is maybe as like various attempts to kind of try to get privacy and data governance law to grapple with prediction value more effectively. Now, I have opinions about which of those is like better or worse, but I do think that all of them are, you know, in our kind of framework can be described as like attempts to sort of say like, hey, we're actually playing a pretty fundamental role as a legal regime, like structuring a lot of value creation. Maybe part of the pressure we feel is that it is like businesses are facing hegemonic market pressure to erode privacy. Like, you know, we better start thinking a little bit more systematically about that. I personally am not a huge fan of assigning individual property rights in data. I don't think that gets us very far. I think there are a lot of other regimes that govern and manage property relations that are more institutionally robust that we could start to draw on. So I'm not like categorically against looking at those for inspiration. Intermediate liability gets us some of the way of managing prediction value. I think it's a pretty indirect and maybe imperfect way to get at it. But that's maybe not the only thing intermediate liability is interested in. So measuring it or evaluating it as like a prediction value regulation, meh. Measuring it along some other dimension that people might care a great deal about, maybe it fares better. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Jamie?
Yeah. This idea of prediction is interesting, right? Because we think it's something that we can do well, but what happens when we're wrong?
Yeah.
And I'd love to see your article tie into any literature that's available on that, on the human capacity to predict and like the accuracy or not of our predictions.
Yeah. So it's fun. I mean, like one of the things about writing a piece across fields that are so different is that we have like a lot of literatures that we need to talk to. And one whole class of literature is from like dear friends of mine who are like media and communication scholars and like people who study AI who are like, but a lot of this quote unquote prediction value is worthless. Like it's speculative value. It's like an inflated bubble, to which I'd say like, yeah, that strikes me as plausible and right. But that doesn't mean that the cultivation and chasing of the speculative worthless value isn't nevertheless going to cause huge amounts of social disruption that are legally relevant. So like, using the financial crisis example, like a lot of the inflated value of like mortgage-backed securities was like wrong. That was like wrong. It did not have the value that it purported to have. It was like a totally speculative bubble, and it nevertheless like crashed our economy. So, I think that we are like agnostic on like prediction value. Like, I think it could very well be the case that a lot of like quote unquote prediction value being generated is like snake oil and fake and speculative value that is bad, because to your exact point, like true prediction is hard. I think as like an interesting kind of meta point, like we can't really be in the legal job or like legal business of like regulating, starting to produce responses to say like, here are standards, here are like forms of discipline we're going to impose if you do like speculative snake oil prediction value, if we don't even have like a category to call it, which is a little orthogonal to the question you asked, but it is the version of how like we get asked about this a lot. So yeah, it turns out that like actually accurately predicting is like super hard. But because companies know that you get like a big, market reward for saying that you're really good at predicting, like they're incentivized to like puff how good they are at it. And that creates like speculative value. But again, I think it's like helpful to think about prediction value as like a category. Now we can say like, all right, is this like more accurately priced? Is this less accurately priced? Like how valuable is your prediction value actually?
Hi. Thank you, Professor. This was really very, very useful because I follow this subject. I live out of India, so you mentioning about WhatsApp was
right. Yeah.
Very interesting to me. And I've been following WhatsApp ever since it was started, and particularly in India.
Mm-hmm.
Where today there are more than 535 million users
right.
who are doing some billions of conversations every day. I think that's the most prevalent mode of communication, not SMS texting.
Right.
So which brings me to the larger picture. So you have defined the whole EV versus EV. I would say to an extent macro and a little bit maybe micro from a perspective from where I am coming from. Let's take the case of India itself. The largest number of WhatsApp users in the world, the largest number of Facebook users, not the largest number of Twitter users, largest number of Gmail users. So, everything you take, it being an English language rich country that way, and digitally, it's more than, every other language taken together. So the amount of data that is being generated from a perspective of data security, data management, let me even take it a little bit more to a national security perspective also, when you go at it, because if you look at these platforms, they have gone much beyond the intermediary liability, provisions and all. They, in many cases, they don't respect or possibly they become far much more powerful to influence what should be the intermediary liability rules, laws, whatever you say. So we were speaking with Professor Raymond 2 weeks back and with Professor Joyce the other Monday. Where is this whole data story in India emanating? Because it is a kind of an indicator about how the world story is also shaping up, because the volume of data is more and the number of users playing into this is more, and there could be elements where the problem of where PV can be more closer to EV exists. However, if you look at the country over the last 20 years, India's service industry, the IT service industry, has always maintained a compounded annual growth rate of more than 8 to 9%, even through the 2008 crisis till date. And those were all based on the agreements that individual companies had with the data handlers up there. We didn't have a data protection, personal data protection law even till a month back. So, which brings me now to the question. So when this data privacy and it comes to the point of that normative part that you mentioned, the doctrinal part, that privacy as a consent is something not the right approach, possibly. It's a wrong approach you mentioned. And we deviated 4 times from a position that we took on the personal data protection bill. And finally, we came to this premise 2 months back. We still took consent as the main basis. Now, to a great extent, why we changed 3 times the original legislation was the influence that these big tech companies wield. I am privy to many things, so I can tell you this, that the original draft that was decided based on a privacy as a fundamental right judgment in 2017 by the Supreme Court of India was done by a Supreme Court judge, which had a lot of tighter provisions in trying to control this big tech. But over all these 3 iterations, we have diluted that because their lobbying powers, even using governments, or the business lobbies and everything, as you know very well, that has resulted in that. And this is going to be possibly the future. So the whole premise around EV becoming or moving more closer towards EV, I personally see is happening because they are far much more powerful. Even the fear to look at big tech might not result in that level of possibly control. Possibly the Europeans tried the best in trying to make it very strict or even penalizing to that extent. But where do you see is the scenario going, because it possibly somewhere it goes scary. It's not, the last part that you said that artificial intelligence things might be, no, the amount of data that is being generated. I have a digital payment system in the country which has carried everyone. The man who never did a digital transaction today does at least 50 transactions. So every day in a month, illiterate men's about 15,000 transactions are there. Now that is for all the data harvesters. So the gap between PV and EV possibly is going to shrink far much more. That's the point. How do you see it?
Right. Yeah. So again, I think for us, we see it as a general problem for you could pick any legal regime and you're going to encounter some version of this problem, which is the sheer amount of power that companies can generate as a form of prediction value, speculative or not, that they can sort of use in their wealth accumulation strategies, in their competition strategies, in their political lobbying strategies, because it's completely naive, as you point out, to think that these companies are never engaged in geopolitics. And, that's a general problem for international legal regimes, domestic legal regimes to grapple with. What I think is interesting about thinking with Amanda about international taxing authority is that countries like India are, in a sense, fighting with one arm tied behind their back, because one major form of discipline that they could exercise on these companies, which is taxing authority, they can't exercise. So that's just kind of pointing out that or I'm South African. So like the entire African continent is generating huge amounts of prediction value. We're recreating old geopolitical forms of resource extraction that puts countries in a very weak position to do something about extremely powerful entities. So, you know, granting India taxing authority over, you know, hundreds of millions of WhatsApp users is not going to overnight solve the problem, but it at least gives them one more stick, you know, in that kind of rebalancing of these institutions, because we're talking about massively wealthy companies, and the only realistic forms of counter-institutional power that we have are nation states. So what does it mean for us to kind of update our regulatory and legal models to sort of encounter that moment? And one thing alone is not going to solve it. The taxing authority alone is not going to solve it. But pointing out that having countries like India fight with one arm tied behind their back has ripple effects on the other legal regimes that are then sort of that they attempt to use to exercise and rein in these forms of power. They can't use taxing authority. So what are they left with? They're left with data protection. They try to impose strong privacy protections. And for the record, I do believe we have privacy interests that deserve to be protected against companies. They just, you know, that leaves them weakened against the exercise of prediction value in the form of lobbying, in the form of sort of pressure on those remaining sets of sticks that countries have. So that's sort of a way of saying, like, I don't think that we're like, here's a solution, here's a solution, here's a solution, but it is sort of pointing out conceptually that like we're leaving a lot on the table when we use old models of international sort of regulatory authority in thinking we can rein in sort of new forms of, again, like I should have this slide with the richest companies up, you know, hugely internationally wealthy and powerful entities. So yeah, you know, I think that Europeans are in a sense better equipped. Cynically, I think it's because they're in part in a geopolitical position where they're like, why, like they are now subject to being on the receiving end of a more powerful extractive industry when they have historically been in the subject of being on the taking end of that relationship. So they are better positioned, I think, to try to push back on it. But, you know, they still in some sense can misalign, you know, like on the OECD pillar frameworks, like Ireland is the other country that tanks those agreements because that's where the tax havens of these countries, of these companies sit. So, you know, it's very easy for them to just sort of flip a country into, you know, lobbying on their behalf under the kind of existing frameworks. And Ireland and, you know, Bermuda and the US are playing a big role in tanking the tax solution, at least.
I think the OECD digital taxation part is
Yeah.
something which has to be looked at.
Yeah.
Gustavo?
Okay. So probably three brief comments. So the first one, I would run away 1,000 miles again from the concept of distinguishing use values and exchange values. This is something coming from Marx, it's highly discredited in economics. Most economists or people with some training in economics will essentially stop reading your article as soon as they see use values and exchange values. More importantly, I don't think you need it, and it's making your life more complicated. So essentially the problem that you have is that there are some companies producing and offering some service, let's say whatever, and then in the process, they're also producing another product, which is data. And you can perfectly use standard tools in economics to deal with co-productions of two different goods or services by the same company. You can even talk about market power. Indeed, it's much easier to talk about market power using standard tools rather than distinguishing use values and exchange values. Again, I would encourage you to just use classical tools there. The second point is like, I'm not sure about the taxation part for the following reasons. First of all, these companies are doing a lot of cross-subsidization. So WhatsApp is free because they're collecting information. So essentially provide me one service for free because they are expecting to collect revenue selling part of my data. So in some sense, the market power thing, I think is very interesting and maybe not common, but you also have a lot of experience in other areas like telecommunications with a lot of cross subsidies. So maybe some of those ideas could be also used. And finally, some doubts about countries cannot tax. You can only use, you can always tax indirectly the main service. If India wants to tax indirectly that US companies that are collecting data on India, they can just tax the use of WhatsApp, period, or any other app within their territory, and they collect part of those rents. I think the reason they're not doing it is like that tax probably is extremely unpopular.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the use value versus exchange value does not originate with Marx. It's much older than Marx. It's classic political economy. Adam Smith discussed it, Ricardo discussed it, Marx discussed it, Aristotle discussed it. So I have no problem with economists wanting to think exclusively in exchange value, wanting to talk about market value. We find the concept useful purely as a descriptive technique, again, to hold these things apart. Because again, I think there are all sorts of ways in which contemporary economics, which I have 2 degrees in economics, like I like thinking in exchange value. I know what I think, you know, I'm with you. It's helpful to think about it in terms of market power. That is the entire set of conversations going on in antitrust right now. Tons of people are thinking in that way. Helpful, not helpful. You get into a bunch of technocratic conversations and debates that like neither of us have PhDs in economics. We're not really interested in nor equipped to really like meaningfully push forward. Good luck to all of those people. Fellow travelers, great. However, I do think, you know, we have like secondary kind of interests and agendas. So to begin to think about the capacity that companies are building up for law enforcement to find out that I'm likely in the process of having a miscarriage or an abortion and socially discipline me. I think a lot of people would say that what's wrong with that is not that that's being like inadequately priced, right?
Yes,
It is
I would
normatively wrong
say that.
in a different way.
Say
I completely agree. So the concept of prediction value allows us to more generally track the phenomenon and say like, it's being commodified in these ways, it's getting market value in these sets of ways. We can call that co-production, but we want to draw attention to, in the same conversation, other forms in which power can be exercised that are not necessarily commoditized, that are not market forms of exercise of value, and that like we might actually have normative qualms with thinking about in terms of price. So in law and economics, like Eric Posner famously talked about like a market for marriage and like a market for adoption. And those things I can tell you hit legal scholars in like a bad way. Right? They react very negatively to thinking about that because there are classes of normative concern that people do not think are quantified harms. Like we might not think that child labor is bad because child laborers are likely to be systematically underpaid by the market. We might think that that's like a qualitative harm, that like the commodification of childhood is itself the problem. So again, for us, part of the conceptual benefit of holding apart prediction value and exchange value is that like, to my third point, some of how prediction value is being exercised might not be a qualitative harm. It might be a quantitative harm, or like sorry, it's not a quantitative harm. It's a qualitative.
Use the concept.
I am fine with people using the concept of externality. We are not speaking to economists in this piece. We're speaking to legal scholars in this piece. And I think for them, like, we can talk about child labor as an externality, but it is Bernard Williams has this great quote about moral language that underspecifies the topography of the moral wrong. And talking about being disciplined for having an abortion as an externality really misses a lot of the normative features of that moral wrong that we are allowed to bring back into our concept when we use non-neoclassical economic language to talk about the concept. Which is not to say that other people can't use that language. I'm in favor of people using that language. All power to antitrust scholars doing that, like in favor of it. But there are other, again, topographies of the phenomenon that we want to capture in our concepts that we think are better captured by the concept of prediction value.
Explicit and use, and talk about fairness in the allocation and use of information. Be explicit, why introducing use values, exchange values, kind of it confuse all the discussion instead of going to the point. Fairness in the way information is used in an unfair way.
But it's also cultivated for a set of reasons that skew who gets to make those decisions, which is ultimately from like a legal scholarly perspective. I'm interested in questions of institutional design. I'm interested in questions of like which types of issues and problems and frankly normative animating concerns ought we take into account when we assign interests in information, who gets to exercise those interests, how those interests ought to be constrained. That is all stuff that is.
It's so normative and fairness.
I'm not gonna let an argument.
Yeah. Sorry.
Anyway, that's my view.
Thank you.
In favor.
Sorry.
Okay, I think in getting to part of this is that I noticed in your article, you cite a lot Julie Cohen's work.
Mhm.
Okay. And I think you've missed an opportunity to better incorporate some of the framing that she's done to help you with this.
Sure.
Importantly, she's talking about there being essentially a transformation from industrialization to an informational capitalism. And importantly, she's tapping into the work by Carl Polanyi
Yeah.
about a transformation.
Mhm.
So basically this idea that there tends to be counter movements. So it sounds to me that what you're talking about with Amanda is the need for this counter movement in a Polanyi sense, where essentially what's happening is that with the marketization and things that are happening in information, in a Polanyi movement, there needs to be a counter movement because of the effects on society. Okay. And so you're just picking off a couple pieces of this Polanyi counter movement. He wrote the book on politics of regulation, where some of the relevant laws might be tax or privacy. But I think it would help if you could, and I don't know if you've thought about it this way, if you could better address really what you're talking about is the need for this Polanyi counter movement and picking up on the themes that Julie Cohen has already articulated. Now, she has some errors in my view in characterizing some of the net neutrality and some of the communication stuff. But to me, that's actually a symptom of the very thing she's describing. Because what you're talking about is with this informational capitalism is a form of the power. Okay, that third category you had about power. Well, one of the problems with trying to do a counter movement, as you're talking about, is how the very entities who would extract power from this information will use it to block the counter movement. And they will use it to try and block what you're doing. And in fact, Julie Cohen's book actually reflects the errors that have been shoved by a lot of these companies when she tries to characterize common carriage and public utilities coming from monopoly. No, they don't. And I did my dissertation on that subject 20 years ago, and I've been fighting this for 20 years, is this power because they're trying to escape regulation, how they've skewed the legal arguments in such a way. So all I'm offering you is that I think since you're driving in part from Julie Cohen, at least you're saying that, I think to help situate what you're doing within that frame as well could help the readers better understand what you're trying to accomplish. Because then you can get into the societal impacts and things like that that might not be captured by the traditional neoclassical way of looking at it. Do you see what I'm saying? And that could help you make your argument of why you're trying to incorporate insights and ways of framing and looking at it to help counter some of the framing that the traditional framing. So we can talk more about that, but I would really suggest that you go back and extract from Julie Cohen's framing where your piece fits in with what she's talking about, because she's talking about the bigger problem.
Yeah. So I've read Julie. I've read almost all of Julie's work. I draw a great deal on it. I think both like. So yes, I mean you're right that we're working on a narrower part of the problem. I am also a student of Polanyi and have read The Great Transformation. I usually kind of think of counter movements actually as typically like the reactionary move. The counter movement is like World War I, not like the regulation that comes back, but at least in Polanyi's work,
What
but
you're describing is exactly that, though.
yeah,
Society is responding to
yes. So
the way
so-
information is being used.
I think the reason that we don't, I mean, we're already doing a lot of conceptual and theoretical setup in the piece, so adding like a whole other layer might be a great deal, but you know, I mean, I think we are clearly drawing on Julie's book in kind of the setup. Again, I think that we're really we're just interested in a sense, a more narrow slice of the
Well, I just want to
problem.
share with you, in reading your paper, I understood it better, having read Julie Cohen's already. And having read Polanyi and having read that, I better understood what I thought you were trying to do. So
Mhm.
without having had that, it's almost like you're narrowing too quickly, and this is the thing, and people don't
Mhm.
understand the big picture where you're going with it.
Right.
So I'm just sharing with you, that's just my perspective.
No, that's helpful.
Having just freshly read this summer
Right.
her book and Polanyi and all being fresh in my mind, it actually helped me, I thought, to better appreciate what you're attempting to do. So I was just saying, for the benefit of readers who haven't read that yet, or maybe showing that, it might help them to understand where you're coming in. So it's
Right.
just a feedback about that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
We are officially out of time. You
Oh,
had
no,
Joyce
okay.
and Jess left.
Okay.
So as we grab lunch
But
and then a couple
I'm
people
around, so
here.
yeah,
Yes.
that would be,
So thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Wonderful paper, great.